Good morning on this Sunday, August 4th. The first counties to use Georgia's new voting machines are gearing up for November. The FAA announces a new investigation into Hartsfield-Jackson International, and your check may not be in the mail when it comes to the Equifax settlement payout. Alexis, Phil, and Theron are all here. The debate and discussion begin right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
We're getting a new look at Georgia's new voting machines. Paulding County will be one of the first counties to test them out in November.
They can actually hold that ballot, they can see who they've selected, and then they can deposit it into the ballot box. And then we can audit that to make sure that their vote counted in the way they wanted it to count.
Deirdre Holden, Paulding County's elections and registration supervisor, showed Fox 5 News the new vendor's video. It includes the setup of the new machines, the voting process, which looks pretty much like before, but the difference is the new paper ballot that will be printed with your results.
Is there any way to tamper any of this?
No, because nothing's going to be web-based, and that's the thing about it.
Lawmakers approved more than $100 million of taxpayer money to buy the new machines. The first time they will be used statewide is expected to be in March of 2020. Now, Phil, there were concerns that some of these machines would just print out the barcode, but it looks like they're actually printing out the ballots. Do you think that this is acceptable?
I think that that'll allay some fears. But I think, and I'm glad we are testing it in some of these municipalities. That'll be very good. Although, as I mentioned on the show last week, and I think we've discussed it before, there's a very important court case before federal judge Amy Totenberg. And I think this is going to be critical as to what's going to happen and how we ultimately vote probably in 2020. The issue is, should we have paper ballots that you fill out by pen? And Judge Totenberg, we've heard hearings a week ago. We've also heard what she said before the election last year in 2018. She does not like the state's arguments. I reviewed some of the hearings. The state but did not do well in its arguments. I think the judge could well order that we have to go to a new system of paper ballots to be filled out by a pen. So I think Judge Totenberg should be ruling shortly.
We'll see what happens for the November elections. But Theron, I want to go back to these machines because, you know, any machine can be tampered with, right? So a lot of the critics now, though, are saying they want to go back to these paper ballots where you actually fill them out by hand. But at some point, a machine does come into play, right? Because they have to be tallied. So going back to paper ballots, would it really solve anything?
Well, I think there's really two tracks here. You know, we got to applaud the Secretary of State for trying to do the best that he can, because he's admitted, and others have admitted, there were some irregularities and there were problems with the voting process and the voting machine. But as Alexis pointed out to us last week, you know, it's all about secure and fair elections, right? And we know that cybersecurity is a real big issue here. So even me as a Georgian, I'm torn. I do want a paper ballot. I think that this new machine will produce a paper ballot. But I do worry about some of the problems that we've seen the previous machines, which now looks like we're sort of adopting, and we already know that that machine, that which I think taxpayers are going to pay $100 million for, is somewhat obsolete. And so I think that this Paulding County election will be a step forward, but I think going even further, we're going to have to figure out a way to give voters in Georgia the peace of mind to know that they have some type of documentation that shows through this machine that their votes were counted fairly and properly. But I do think going completely back to a paper ballot, it's just not something that we can do only, but we've got to have a machine that processes the votes properly and that voters feel they are secure.
Alexis, what do you think? Is this machine a good compromise? I mean,
Well,
we kind of saw it in that video.
Let's hope so, although in one of the demonstrations it was reported that you have to cast the ballot before you can print out the thing. So you don't know if it got changed or not. I mean,
Well, when it prints out, then you get a chance to see what you.
But
who
you've
you
already
voted for.
cast the ballot, and if it's wrong, then
You
what do
can
you do?
change
You
it,
can
though,
change
at the
it.
end.
You can go back
change
in.
it.
Go back and change.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. But you know, it's still a machine, as Theron said, and Phil too. So we'll see what happens. But you know, at some point they're going to have to figure it out. And this will be a good test in November. We'll see.
We'll be watching Paulding County for sure. Well, in the healthcare world, all eyes were on Utah this week after the White House rejected a state waiver for a limited expansion of Medicaid. And Utah's plan sounds very similar to the one that Georgia is exploring. Phil, some reports suggest that the White House will not accept anything but a full expansion of Medicaid, and that's not really a conservative stance. So what happens now here in Georgia?
Well, like in all administrations, there's a division of thought. lot. You're right about Utah. It's very similar to what Georgia's trying to do. It'll be interesting to see how our U.S. senators and our governor can maybe persuade the one man that will make the final decision, the President of the United States. So right now it's up in the air.
Were you surprised, though? Because a lot of conservatives don't want a full Medicaid expansion.
Right, but we're dealing with the deep state bureaucracy.
What?
And so, yes, there is a deep state bureaucracy. Welcome to what's happening in 21st century America. Some of these bureaucrats don't want to have this at all. And so I think you've got one school of thought fighting an entrenched bureaucracy that doesn't want to see the waivers.
Well, Theron, we don't really know
They
what...
want to see the expansion, the full expansion, as most people do who need health
which is very costly and would cost billions. Even Nathan Deal, who you liked, warned us against that in Georgia.
Yes, but they're asking for the federal government to pay 90% for the waivers. What's the difference?
Well, we're already drowning in debt, so we don't want to drown in any more debt.
But Governor Kemp has realized that, there is a need for some type of Medicaid expansion to cover those who are uninsured. Theron, we don't really know the details of the waivers for Georgia, but what did you make of this Utah decision?
Well, listen, I think one of the things we want to point out is that, and Phil just kind of talked about it, we don't know what this president is going to do. I mean, for him to, and his administration, to basically reject Utah's Medicaid waiver expansion, I know people in Georgia are like, oh my God, like that could happen here. So let's talk about what's really happening. You have a Republican governor with 2 Republican senators who now, I'm sure, are bombarding the White House to say, hey, what is it about Georgia's plan that is similar to Utah's? Because if it's something that they can change at the last minute, let's fix it. But the one thing that I pulled up this week, Lori, which is very startling to me, is that 27% of Georgians between the ages of 19 and 34 in this state right now are totally uninsured. And so when you look at that stat, and one of the things that is really baffling to me is that when you look at the stat of older Georgians who don't have health insurance, who probably need it the most, this is all about the Democrats' call for full Medicaid expansion. So I suspect that the governor's team may now think that the Trump administration has done them a favor, because now they can probably go back in and look at some different ways of how they can change the plan or maybe modify it. But this was also something that I think Democrats have kind of been a little silent on, to say, hey, look, even President Trump and his administration thinks that we need to look at some states and fully expand Medicaid. And so I think it's an ongoing debate, but I think it's in trouble, but I think it's fixable, and I think the governor tried to do the right thing.
I'm more cynical than you are. I think that they're saying they're not promoting full expansion, they're promoting no expansion, because they're forcing the states to come up with a full expansion or nothing.
Well,
and most of the conservative states will come up with nothing.
Let's just, as a footnote, though.
I'm sorry, then the governor can say to his constituents, I tried, but I couldn't do it.
But Alexis, let's remember one thing. Let's explain what the waivers are. They're waivers to get out from under this command and control Obamacare, which has screwed everything up. And it's to help, Theron, as you know, some low-income people get insurance, and some senior citizens. So it's not nothing.
Well, I'm saying they're not going to get it if they.
Well, I agree with Theron. The ball's up in the air. We're going to see what happens.
I just hope that a Republican governor with 2 Republican senators are not just waiting for this, I think, decision to come down about Utah. I would hope that if you got that much power and that much coordination, that you now let's say if Alexis is right. Let's say if Alexis that the Trump administration is saying either full or none, then that really puts the state in a very, very bad position.
And it becomes a key issue in 2020 for the U.S. Senate.
So get ready, Phil. You thought Medicaid expansion was all over TVs in 2018. It's going to definitely be there in 2022.
I've always said, even in spite of this issue, I've always said health care is going to be a big issue for both parties. But I think the Republican Party has a better message.
All right. Well, coming up, the FAA is taking a closer look into how Hartsfield-Jackson is using federal money.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
The AJC reports this week the FAA has launched a new investigation into how the city of Atlanta is using airport funds. Theron, though, this sounds really familiar. The FAA is looking into whether the city used airport funds to pay legal fees in the federal corruption probe during the Reid administration.
Yeah, so it's a new investigation, but it's also looking at old
Issues, yeah.
procedural things that were done under the previous administration. One of the things that I think that was very clear to me in reading the story is really a legal question, because one of the things that the FAA was requesting were some documents that I think the city attorney and the city determined that they had to turn over those documents, but a little bit redacted, because as we know is that you have privilege between your private attorneys when you're a government. And so I think that there's a request. And let's also know that this is some of the same information that the federal government requested that the city gave over, but some of it had to be redacted. And so I just think that this is a clear example when you have this federal organization, this federal department working with the world's busiest and most efficient airport to basically make sure that everything is proper. The city's posture, I think, is that, hey, we've been under many of these audits before. We'll turn over this information and we will continue to be the world's busiest and world's most efficient airport. And so I do think that while it is a new investigation, to me it's really kind of tied up into an interpretation of what can the city and cannot do when it comes to turning over the privileged information between them and their attorneys.
Well, the city cannot use airport money for lawyers in a federal
illegal.
corruption probe. That's one thing they cannot do. Phil, this one also though has a lot of tentacles.
But
too.
it hasn't been determined yet. That's what the investigation.
Well, we do know one
is
thing:
going.
$100,000 was illegally stolen from the fund.
Who said it was illegally? Did you say that? Or
The FAA. The FAA is probing why this was done. In fact, the city admitted they did it and paid back $90,000.
There was money paid back.
So
So you're mixing two now. You're talking about a different payment. This has nothing to do with
That's what I'm saying. This
has-
one has a lot of tentacles. That's what I wanted Phil to weigh in.
the FAA, this is not the first time, as we pointed out, the FAA is investigating corruption, perhaps. So $7.5 million is what the city of Atlanta has already shelled out to lawyers because of the ongoing federal corruption probe. No wonder the FAA got involved, because they saw some funny business here. Not all the records have been turned over, Theron, you know that, and they're still trying to ascertain, what is happening. So I think, again, it's proof as to why you need a state oversight authority like the World Congress Center and the Georgia Ports Authority. You can have all the audits and all of the anything in the world, but you still have this nonsense and corruption going on.
Alexis, does it give the supporters of this airport takeover ammunition?
Well, they don't need ammunition. They just want to take it over anyway because it is a cash cow. And it is a tremendous asset for the city. It'd be a tremendous asset for the state. So I just think, of course they'll use whatever they can use, but I think it is just a simple case that needs to be resolved, and the current administration is working with the officials to do that. And the reason they found out about this is because of the public checkbook on the internet that the current administration published about city funds. So.
And no one talks about that. And Alexis, I'm so glad you said that, right? Listen, this mayor, when I said that she was the most transparent mayor ever, some of you all gawked at me on the panel, but I want to double down on what Alexis just said. This mayor is not trying to hide this information. I mean, they're cooperating. Now,
they're not releasing all documents.
But this is the thing, and this is where I don't want to call out different media outlets, but we can't just make it breaking news and top of the fold every time you have a federal agency doing their job and working with a local government. I just didn't think that this new investigation, this new sort of open probe into this investigation was not worthy of breaking news. And listen, I agree with Alexis. I think that the state senator who introduced this bill, who he failed the first time, will reintroduce it again. But I do think that they have looked at this, and this does not give any sort of concrete evidence of why we should have a state takeover of this airport. But I do think that it's something that the critics can say, hey, look at this. They can kind of dangle at it and look at all this stuff going to the airport. But it's an ongoing probe. And like Alexis said, it's coming to fruition partly because this mayor has basically opened up the entire government to these reporters and to the FAA.
I want to move on because we did have some new developments in the scooter controversy in the city of Atlanta. We had yet a third scooter-related death this week, and it seems every week we are talking about another death, really in the past 3 weeks or so. So is it time to go back to sidewalks? Is it time to put a moratorium on this until they figure it out? I mean, the city of Atlanta is unlike so many others that have scooters. We just don't have a lot of room on our streets. What do we do? Theron, do you want to start?
Well, I think, listen, my heart and my condolences go out to the young woman's family who unfortunately passed away by riding a scooter, and she unfortunately got hit by a car and died. And so I do think there's some sympathy from me as a person who represents one of the companies. But I think that what you're going to see is that the council is going to come back this week. They've been on break, City Council of Atlanta, and they're going to look at the mayor's moratorium, which she issued, to say no new permits, which I do think will reduce temporarily the amount of scooters scooters that we have on the street. But I've said this before, Lori, I think that, yes, it's on the scooter riders for them to be safe and for them to be aware of cars, but also it's on the people who operate their vehicles too. I mean, we've got
like bicycle riders.
Yeah,
and
we've got to be
drivers.
more cautious. We've got to be more acceptable to these folks who want to use this means of transportation to get around. And this is another person. I think the first unfortunate gentleman who passed away was in his 40s. This woman, I think, was in her mid 30s.
Yeah.
And so it's not just young kids, you know, riding. I mean, there's people all over this community who want to take advantage of this good resource, but we do have to do something about it.
Well, I think it's time now to stop everything. I think you've got a third death. I think some city council people already were saying, you know, we can't have any more deaths. Then you've got another issue that these e-scooters are being thrown in rivers, and there's an environmental concern. We weren't ready for it. I think even you have to admit that, even though you work for a company. I agree with you, Alexis, when we said last week that there's certain areas where that bus accident occurred that they just were not ready to have on the streets an e-scooter. They never should have been there. On the sidewalks, it's been a huge problem. I think we need to take a pause and get this right. I don't know how long the moratorium should last. I think that's worthy of a debate on council.
Well, yeah, I think that the councilman who represents that district, Faroki, says that he wants the city to be designed so that it'll be safe for everyone, and
Right.
that's, I don't know how long that could take.
He makes a good point.
But
Yeah.
I don't know if they're willing to do a moratorium until they get a design in place. But
All right, well, we're going to move on. If you're expecting that $125 settlement claim in the Equifax data breach, don't hold your breath, and we'll explain coming up.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
Well, tensions are rising in Cobb County, where residents want answers on whether they're at an increased risk for cancer because they live close to a facility that sterilizes medical equipment. Now, the company is called Sterigenics and releases ethylene oxide into the air, a chemical the EPA says causes cancer. What I find fascinating here is the state EPD in a statement said they're basically relying on the company to do the right thing and not conducting their own tests, and the company stopped actually reporting emissions. I mean, this is an outrage, Phil.
Well, it is an outrage, and you cannot rely on Sterigenics anymore to do any of its own internal testing. I am proud of Smyrna Mayor Max Bacon. He said just the other day, and he's asked the city to do their own independent study, and I think Derek Norton on the council and other council people are for that. And then let's see what happens to see if these, how badly high a toxic level is this. Now, the plant is actually outside the city of Smyrna. The federal EPA issued a warning a year ago, but I think everybody missed that.
They did.
And certainly
there was no
the
press
state.
release, there was
and
no
so
news release.
I am furious with the state EPD on this, and I think they owe us some explanations.
Well, the thing is, it should be chilling to everybody, because even though this Sterigenics is located near Cobb County somewhere, but like we as Georgians, especially in this metro area, I mean, it's just
It impacts 25-mile radius.
25-mile radius. And so to Phil's point, you know, we were never communicated with the public, but let's talk about what this company really has done. Number one, it's broke the trust of the neighborhoods that surround it, right? I'm being told that they spend an enormous amount of time communicating to the neighborhoods when they move there. The second thing is that we can't have any confidence in this company to self-report basically what they're doing. The EPD, the EPA, the governor's office, I know Senator Jen Jordan is kind of waiting on this, Cobb County officials, whatever city it's in, they need to all come together and get this fixed right away, because this is terrible, not only for the people who live around there, but just for all of us in this metro area.
it's aerosols into the air.
And the thing is that I still don't see the sense of outrage and urgency from the people who are basically employed to make sure that stuff like this doesn't happen. But this should be the number one priority of the state, and cities should come together. And then I think the EPA
And I want
should
to hear from the
definitely
governor on this too. I think the governor has to weigh in and really get things moving on this. So, well, the check is not in the mail, says the Federal Trade Commission. If you filled out a claim for form in the Equifax data breach settlement, don't expect that $125 payment. So many of us went on the site. We're expecting that payment. The Federal Trade Commission says we won't even get close to $125. Now they're saying, look, you can only get really your credit monitored. We all have our credit
Yes,
monitored,
anyway,
right, from
right.
another data
Right.
breach. So I think this is disappointing to a lot of folks.
Yeah, well, it is disappointing that what happened in the first place happened, that they exposed everybody's numbers and private information. And they should be penalized for it, and we should be compensated for it. But $125, maybe not so much, huh?
Well, we do have an interview with the Assistant Attorney General here in Georgia. Her name's Melissa Devine, and she weighed in to Fox 5 News. Let's hear what she had to say.
There's a lot of misinformation and confusion, I think, about the settlement and what it was intended to accomplish. It was not intended to compensate consumers for the mere fact that their data was exfiltrated.
Well, she's right. I mean,
We'll give her A for honesty there.
she's right. There is a lot of confusion
I tell
and
you what,
misinformation.
everybody ought to be changing their passwords and checking their credit reports, that's for
Exactly
sure.
right.
But the
Exactly.
question is also, was this designed to properly compensate people who basically thought or knew that their information could be compromised, or was it another way for Equifax to get more and more data on the people that they serve? and
Wow,
I think,
talk about conspiracy.
yeah, I mean, talking about conspiracy. And so, I want to be very critical. I know a lot of folks who work at Equifax, and they do a lot of good jobs, but I do think they have a communications problem here, and they have a trust problem, because this now I also read that they didn't expect the consumers to basically follow the orders that they put out, and it was just too many people to compensate. So this is just a really bad day for Equifax.
All right, well, now I want to move on to one of Phil's favorite stories. The Democratic Socialists of America are coming to Atlanta. Are you going to be there to
10 of them.
protest, Phil?
Yes.
It's their annual convention, and Georgia Democrats, though, are distancing themselves.
Well, I'm glad to see Georgia Democrats distancing themselves, because it's probably the most realistic thing they can do. I saw the vice chairman of the party say that we're not a home to socialists, and I had to burst out laughing, because why? You've got Ted Terry and you've got Teresa Tomlinson, the Democratic Party's two U.S. Senate candidates that want to unseat David Perdue, saying that they basically are socialists. Ted Terry was actually a member of this European Socialist group, which I don't understand why he had to go to Europe. He could just hang out with the socialists here. But the message is economic freedom versus expensive command and control socialism. And so I'm interested to see how many Democrat officials are going to show up this weekend to talk to these socialists.
Well, it's a different organization altogether from the Democratic Party, for one thing. And I think nationwide they've got like 56,000 members, which is not a huge swath of the population. And I also think that there is a difference. In fact, it was, I think, the mayor of Indiana, the debate said that if we go to the left, they're going to call us wild democratic socialists, or call us wild socialists. If we go to the center or right, they're going to call us wild socialists, talking about the Democrats. So it doesn't matter what they say. You're going to still have your talking point in calling the all
Well,
Democrats
you know what?
socialists.
It's funny. Some of the Democratic candidates, to their credit, said these are not conservative or Republican talking points. These are facts, especially when you had several people like former Congressman John Delaney, Tulsi Gabbard, even Joe Biden had to say, look, this Medicare for all is crazy. The math doesn't work. So you've got the left, Alexis, and the crazy left.
Well, I disagree with you, and I think Medicare for all can work, include private insurance as well, because everybody's Medicare only covers like 80% of the bill, and then you get
Virtually
the
all the
private
Democrats
company.
want to
That's
wipe
last
out
word.
Medicare Advantage.
All right, last word, because otherwise we won't have time for winners and losers, and that's coming up right after the break.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
Alexis, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. I want to give one more shout out of happy birthday to C.T. Vivian, who celebrated his 95th birthday this past week with a wonderful gala dinner surrounded by friends and supporters of his institute, which is a civil rights and civic responsibility institute at Clark Atlanta University that he continues to support for young folk to teach the next generation. So congratulations to him
Yes.
and all the folks who made it a wonderful event.
And a happy birthday, Phil.
Well, we mentioned the socialists that are meeting in Atlanta. They're obviously my
told you it was
loser.
his favorite.
But my winner is Eric Erickson and his center-right political conference, which is a stark contrast. They're also meeting this weekend. Vice President Pence has come in, and again, the issue is economic freedom versus this command and control control, big spending, big tax, Democratic policy. I got one last winner. That is the Peachtree City Little League players. You know, they're having their game Friday night. If they win the semifinal, then they could go on to the World Series. So I think they're winners no matter what, but I'm rooting for them.
Good for them. And Theron?
Definitely want to echo what Alexis said. Happy 95th birthday to C.T. Vivian. He looked great at his birthday party, so definitely want to give him a happy birthday. Also, I want to commend the Atlanta Public Schools for offering daily and free breakfast and lunch for their students. And so no matter whether you qualify or not, they're going to give this for a certain period of time. And then also I want to make Speaker David Ralston a winner. He introduced a new paid family leave policy in the House. And so this is a big deal where people now will be able to fully explore paid family leave when they have births and different things. And then lastly, I want to make my losers the Democrats who are falling for the Republican bait by criticizing President Barack Obama. President Barack Obama does not need me to defend him. His record would speak for itself. But I do want to criticize those Democrats that piled on a little bit too much on former Vice President Biden on this stellar record from Obama.
All right, well, my winner this week is Deputy Billy Baker. He is a Troup County Sheriff's deputy. He's battling stage 4 esophageal cancer. This comes just after he cared for his wife, who is now an ovarian cancer survivor. Here's what's interesting. Doctors have given him 3 months to live, but he can't claim Social Security benefits until 5 months. So the community has really surrounded him and are supporting him. There's a fundraiser on August 10th. So we wish you well, Deputy Baker, and wish you good health and praying for you. And that's all for this week. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
The opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the panelists appearing in this program.